Folks, my name is Luke Groff. I'm a herpetologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I appreciate you all having me here to talk about timber rattlesnakes, even though it's not a species that occurs in your neck of the woods. Excited to talk with you. So before we get to the timber rattlesnake, I just want to do a really quick overview of our herp species. And I always use the word herp, but not everybody knows what it is. So I always start off with definition. So herp is short for herpetofauna, which is a term that includes all reptile and amphibian species. And I'm thankful for herp because the word herpetofauna does not roll off my tongue. So here in Vermont, we have 40 native herp species, including 19 reptile species and 21 native amphibian species. 10 species, or 53% of our reptiles, are designated as species of special concern, threatened, or endangered. And then 6 species, or 29% of our amphibians, are designated as species of special concern or endangered. So if you haven't found it yet, I encourage you to Google Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. They have a website um, with a wealth of information about our native herp species here in Vermont. So they've got species accounts for all 40 species. They have pictures, identification tips, distribution maps, habitats. It's really a great resource for us here in Vermont. Sorry, I'm going to back up 1 second. So I'm not seeing folks, but if there's a question and you want to ask it, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask it. Otherwise, we can take questions at the end. So I can be flexible. But without further ado, this is the timber rattlesnake. So its scientific name is Crotalus or Crotalus horridus, and it's Vermont's only venomous snake species. So despite what you heard, we don't have copperheads, we don't have cottonmouths. This is it for venomous species. As far as identification, um, its color, you don't want to go by color because its color is very variable. So it can be jet black, all black. It can be black with these patterns. It can be tan. It can be yellow. But some better diagnostics are, no matter what color it is, down here at the tail, right before the rattle, all colors of this species, the tail turns uniformly black. Some other diagnostics are these, excuse me, yellow or V-shaped patterns on its back. They're called chevrons. There's typically patterning, but not on all snakes. Another one is the heavy body of these snakes. So they're thick, unlike most of our other species that are more slender, more thin. And it's heavily or strongly keeled. So up here in this diagram, that's a good way to identify. One way to help identify snakes is some of our snakes have smooth scales and some have keeled scales. And when I say keeled, it's just this line running down each scale like the keel of a boat. And even from a distance, these keels give the snake a rough appearance. That's one way to help identify it. And then there's always at least one rattle segment, maybe two, maybe up to 20 or more rattle segments at the end of the tail. These are loose fitting, made out of keratin. This is what produces the rattling sound. I have seen rattlesnakes without any rattles, so that's possible, but it's very rare. And then I said how it comes in different colors. So these are two of the flavors this species comes in. So it comes in a black phase and a yellow phase, but towards the end of the tail, it always turns black. And the other thing I want to say is that this species is not the only species we have that rattles. We have eastern rat snakes, we have eastern milk snakes, and we have North American racers. And all those 3 species, can also vibrate their tails. Typically, they don't sound like much, but if they're in dry leaves or gravel, loose gravel, they vibrate those tails. It can sound an awful lot like rattling. So one thing to keep an eye on is look at the end of the tail. Rattlesnakes typically hold their tail vertically, whereas these other snakes that vibrate their tail, they're usually held horizontal and the tips are like in the leaves or in the gravel to help make the buzzing sound. So here's some highlights about the species conservation and life history. So the species is endangered in Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. It's threatened in New York, and it's extirpated or locally extinct in Maine and Rhode Island. So the species requires, and I should say here in Vermont, you can see on the map, the green is the current distribution where it's found. The red is where it used to be found. So here in Vermont, our populations and New Hampshire's populations represent the very and eastern New York. Our populations represent the very northeastern extent of the species range. So the species requires specific habitats. So in northern populations like ours, snakes overwinter in deep rock fissures or talus slopes that have crevices that extend below the frost line. So these dens or hibernacula are considered like home base for northern populations. So without these dens and these places that don't freeze, the species wouldn't be able to survive here in Vermont. So that's sort of home base. They're always coming or going from leaving or coming to the den. The species has relatively long migration distances. So there's a 2011-2012 project that I'll talk later that showed rattlesnakes in at least one of our populations can migrate up to 4 miles from their den, straight line distance. And then they have a relatively short active period up here in the north. So their active period ranges basically May to September, so 4 months. And during this short period, they have to make these mile-long migrations to and from the den. They have to find and consume prey. They have to find mates, males, sometimes engage in combat for mates, so they have to combat, and then they have to come back to the dens before winter, all in 4 months. And then some of the threats they face include predators, diseases, persecution and harassment from humans, habitat loss, fragmentation, and then roads and vehicles. Here's a timeline of the species' annual life history here in Vermont. I keep specifying here in Vermont and northern latitudes, northern populations, because their biology and ecology is different up here than down in, say, Georgia, where the climate's different. So here, they brumate. So brumation is just, it's analogous to hibernation, but brumation is a term that's specific to ectotherms. And ectotherms are species that don't regulate their own body temperature. Their body temperature fluctuates with the ambient air temperature. So all reptiles and amphibians are ectotherms. So they brumate from October through April or May, depending on the year. So 7 months they're below ground waiting for warmer temperatures. And then, like I said, late May through October, early October is their active period. And this species is characterized as having a slow life history. Some of you may have heard the term K-selected species. That's a species. So females have relatively small litter sizes. They typically produce between 4 and 14 young whenever they do give birth. And in northern populations, rattlesnakes don't typically reach sexual maturity until 7 to 11 years of age. Females are at the longer end of that range. So females typically become sexually mature at 9, 10 years of age up here. So those females that do survive long enough to reach sexual maturity, they may only breed once or maybe twice in their life. And this is because they don't give birth every year up here in the north. They only reproduce every 3 to 6 years. So gravid or pregnant females, they typically forego eating while gestating their embryos during the summer. They go to these gestation rocks and they just cook. They bask in the sun and they develop their embryos and they forego eating. They may drop 40% of their body weight. So the thought with these prolonged reproductive cycles is that they need years to recover from birthing and years to replenish their stores before they're ready to do it again. And after a female gives birth, she'll stay with her young for 2 weeks. Around 10 to 14 days, those young, her newborns, will shed their skin for the first time. So she'll stay with them to protect them from predators. And after the young shed their skin, the mother leaves. She'll lay down a pheromone trail, a scent trail, back to the den so the babies can find out where to overwinter. And then she'll slither off and try to find a meal or two before winter sets in. So this is one of our only reptiles and amphibians that gives parental care. This maternal care is pretty unique in the herp world. And then there's a researcher in New York. A lot of what we know about rattlesnakes comes from his work, and he's found that timber rattlesnakes can live 40 to 50 years in the wild and probably longer. So they're a long-lived species. Mark DeMules and Alcott Smith, I'll talk about them on the next slide. I'll introduce you to them, but they believe there are at least 25 historic dens across Vermont. These are the red X's. These are historic dens, so they're extirpated or they don't support snakes anymore for one reason or another. And they also found that there's at least 17 other potential den sites that provide suitable habitat but there's no evidence that they ever supported snakes. So it's potentially potential dens. So the point here is that, you know, at one point rattlesnakes were found across our entire state, but nowadays they're restricted to 2 populations here in western Rutland County, these green dots. So if you can't read this table heading down here, it says summary of confirmed extirpated timber rattlesnake dens. Basically, towns that used to have rattlesnakes confirmed are Bristol, Orwell, Salisbury, Pownell, Arlington, Barnett, Waterford, Milton, Jamaica, Royalton, Sharon, Springfield, and Windsor. They don't support them anymore, but they used to. So here in Vermont, like I said, we have 2 populations and 3 denning complexes. One denning complex is thought to support about 50 timber rattlesnakes. Second is thought to support about 170, and then the third is thought to support around 480 timber rattlesnakes. So possibly there's somewhere around 700 timber rattlesnakes in Vermont. So I just want to acknowledge these folks for some important contributions they made to timber rattlesnake conservation in Vermont. So without these guys, we'd know a lot less about the species distribution and ecology here, and we wouldn't have conserved the amount of land that the Nature Conservancy has conserved for the species. So Alcott Smith is a veterinarian. He started monitoring timber rattlesnakes in Vermont in the 1980s when I was still in diapers. Mark DeMules, he used to work for the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, and he was an integral part of conserving the thousands of acres that Nature Conservancy has conserved to support the species. So these two were monitoring snakes, monitoring populations, and advocating for the species before the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department did anything with the species. They also co-wrote the Vermont chapter in the Timber Rattlesnake Conservation Action Plan that was just published in 2021. So a lot of the tables and some of the information I present today come from their work in the chapter they wrote. And lastly, this is Doug Blodgett. He's a retired wildlife biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. He started monitoring rattlesnakes in the early 2000s and is responsible for a lot of the research that I'll talk about here in a few slides. So I just want to acknowledge them quickly. Part of Vermont's regrettable history is its bounty programs. So timber rattlesnake bounties were initiated in Vermont in 1890, and they officially ended 81 years later in 1971. 16 years after the bounty program was repealed, the timber rattlesnake was listed as state endangered in Vermont. So the rattlesnake and the bobcat were the last species to have their bounty programs repealed in 1971. This table summarizes known bounty records during Vermont's timber rattlesnake bounty period. So in West Haven alone, 1,369 rattlesnakes were killed for the bounty program. 807 of those rattlesnakes killed were done so in the last 20 years of the program.
Luke, I have a question about the
Yes.
bounties. This is
Yes.
Wendy Scott. Was that because people thought they were dangerous and wanted to get rid of them?
Yeah, exactly. Believe it or not, venomous species were not well tolerated. They're still not well tolerated today, but especially so back then. So these towns would offer $1 per rattle. So you'd kill a rattlesnake, you'd bring in the rattle, they'd collect it, and then give you $1. So
Wow.
yeah, it was more fear and you know, as a not a nuisance, but I guess a hazard for the community.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. This slide provides an overview of the department's timber rattlesnake project. So there's 4 components, major components. There's research and monitoring, there's habitat conservation, threat mitigation, and outreach. With the rest of this talk, I'll primarily focus on some research and monitoring efforts and a couple of our threat mitigation efforts. So my predecessor, Doug Blodgett, I introduced you to him a couple slides ago. He led a rattlesnake radio telemetry project in 2011 and 2012. So this figure here with all the colors represents the movement data for 22 timber rattlesnakes that were tracked using radio telemetry. Each color represents a different snake, and each of these dots or circles represents a location where that snake was found using radio telemetry. So they found a snake at that location, and I removed the background just to help conceal locations. It's an endangered species, and we don't share specific locations. So two ways we can look at the movement data. The first is mean total distance moved. So this is basically for each snake, if you just summed up the distance, the straight line distance between each of these points, if you just added all these straight line distances, you'd have the total distance moved. So for the 17 males that were tracked, they moved 7.3 miles on average during that 4-month active period. The females, the 3 of them that were tracked, on average moved 3.2 miles. Gestating or pregnant females, 2 of those were tracked and they moved 1.4 miles on average. And then across all 22 snakes, the maximum total distance moved was 12.6 miles. Another way to look at this data is mean maximum displacement. So if you look at all these snakes, you can see they all congregate here, and that's because this is where the dens are. Like we said, all these snakes have to return to the den to overwinter. So mean maximum displacement is basically the straight line distance from the den to each snake's farthest point. So for the 17 males, on average, they moved a straight line distance of 2.2 miles. Females, they moved a straight line distance of 1.4 miles. Gestating or pregnant females moved less than a mile. And then the maximum displacement for any of the 22 snakes, I'm guessing it's this yellow one here, was 3.6 mile straight line distance. What I'm not showing you on this slide, okay, yeah, what I'm not showing you on this slide is that there's a busy road, busy highway right here, just west of all these points. So what's interesting is that all these snakes, most of these snakes, moved east or moved northeast. And the thought here is that those that moved west, they might have been lucky for a time or two, but eventually they're going to get hit on the road and die. So this population over time has learned to stay safe and move north and northeast. Also, what I'm not showing you is that our second timber rattlesnake population is located 7 miles west of this population. So this road serves as a pretty severe barrier for any connections between our two populations.
Luke, can I ask a
Yes,
question about the movement?
absolutely.
So, are there any correlations between topography or land use where they're using like that disparate part at the south?
That's a good question. This area, it's rural, residential area, lots of forest. So the Nature Conservancies conserve hundreds of acres here. There's state forest, state parks. So it's pretty contiguous forest to the east, interspersed with some fields. So yeah, I mean that road that I'm talking about comes around here. So they're doing just what we'd want them to do. They're staying in the appropriate habitat away from residences. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's
Yeah,
see.
that's great. Sad that they can't interbreed with the other population, but
Yeah, well, I'll touch on that a
maybe a
little bit.
likely spot for one of those wildlife crossings.
Great idea, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Maybe glimmer of hope at the end. Um, so another way to look at that same data is to think about the movement data is to calculate the area that the snakes occupied during those 4 months. So this is called home range. Um, so those 17 males on average occupied over 1,400 acres during the 4 months of the active period. Females on average occupied about half of that at 702 acres. And the gestating females, 374 acres. And this is not unexpected because gestating females stay close to the dens. They have these reliable gestation rocks that the females in these populations have been using for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So pretty reliable, staying close. So moving on to annual monitoring that we do with the department. I like to split this up into active and passive monitoring. So active monitoring, I think of as boots on the ground and bodies in the field. Whereas passive monitoring, I think of using equipment or technology or some other technique to monitor from afar without having to be on site. So every year we conduct two types of surveys. Spring egress surveys are the first. They'll be coming up in April and May. And spring egress is when the snakes emerge from their dens after winter. Depending on the weather conditions, they could slowly trickle out of their dens, or if the conditions are right, they could move out of their dens, all at the same time. And that is what lends itself to these surveys. So when these snakes come out, we can walk around the talus, walk around the habitat, and literally just count snakes. And when you do that year after year, this lends itself to population estimates, which is what I presented earlier. So this picture was taken during spring egress. I tried counting them. They're all, coils everywhere, but there's at least a dozen or more rattlesnakes in this one picture. Another monitoring survey that we do annually is birthing surveys. So we visit these known gestation sites. Like I said, they've been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We visit known and potential gestation sites in August and September, and then we count gravid females, and we count the number of litters produced and the number of young produced. So this picture on the left shows some neonates. So timber rattlesnake babies that are just born are called neonates. Once they shed their skin for the first time after about 10 to 14 days, then they are then called young of year or juveniles. So the neonate is pre-first shed. And you can see this one right here has got cloudy eyes. That means this snake's about to shed. And then we also do pit tag marking. Pit tag stands for passive integrative transponder tags. These are just like the vets that put in tags in your cats and dogs in case they're lost. Every pit tag has a unique alphanumeric number. So when we scan the snakes, we know exactly what snake that is, where it was tagged, where it was found in the years since. So we do that at one population. That's our hands-on population. The other population is hands-off, where we don't handle snakes unless it's necessary. And then the two passive monitoring techniques are cord antenna system and camera traps, which I will talk about on this slide. So the cord antenna system, you can see it in these three pictures here. It's basically this black cable, and it's powered by really two very heavy batteries that we lug up the ridge, and then there's some circuitry, and it's all kept in this black waterproof box. And then I ring the cable around the den. So here you can see a rattlesnake den under this this chestnut oak, and this is the cord antenna. So any snake that enters or exits this den will have to cross over or under this cable. And this cable automatically detects the pit tags that we put in the snakes. So I'll be at home sleeping or whatever, and a snake will crawl over this cord and automatically have its pit tag number recorded, as well as the date and time. So it's really and the batteries last for about 2 weeks. So this technique is cheaper, less time in the field, less risks to the people surveying venomous snakes, less risks to the snakes because we're not disturbing their habitat or disturbing their behavior. It's been a real great technique to use. And then we also use trail cameras. I included this picture because a friend from Minnesota sent it to me. It's a timber rattlesnake leaving a den with a bat on its back, which is pretty neat. So these game cameras, there's pros and cons to them. One big con is that these are ectotherm, so they have the same temperature as their environment. So the infrared on the cameras doesn't trigger. So we have to set the cameras to take a picture every minute, which over weeks results in hundreds of thousands of pictures. But fortunately, I have some great volunteers that enjoy going through the pictures and documenting them for me. So these two figures show the number of timber rattlesnakes caught on camera during the fall ingress period and the fall egress period. And this is respect to temperature, and this one's respect to time. So basically the takeaway here is that during the fall, timber rattlesnakes didn't enter or exit their den until after 6 o'clock, until sundown. So 75% of all snakes captured on camera were done so during 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. In contrast, in the spring, only 53% of snakes captured on camera entered and exit during 6 to 11 o'clock at night. And then rattlesnakes were active at temperatures as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but only 3% of all the rattlesnakes captured on camera were active at temperatures below 50 degrees. So 97% of the rattlesnakes captured on camera were active at temperatures 50 and above, 3% at 50 or below, with the lowest being 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, threat mitigation. So Lindsay was asking about this. So roads and vehicles are one of our biggest threats to timber rattlesnake populations. Even venomous snakes don't stand a chance against cars and trucks. So like I said earlier, these roads also fragment habitats and serve as almost complete barriers between our populations. So over the last 5 to 10 years, we've been working with VTrans and their consultants to develop an eco passage or wildlife road crossing project to connect our two populations. So the tentative design is that we plan on installing 3 to 5 large culverts, similar to the one you can see in this picture. 3 to 5 large culverts within a maybe 1.5 mile span of the road, and then we pair them with barrier walls, 1 mile of barrier wall on each side of the road. So this picture here is a conceptual picture from a similar project in Florida. This isn't exactly what ours will look like, but it's a similar idea. Basically, the snakes will hit the wall, not be able to get up on the road because of the lip and the height of the wall, and then they'll be funneled to these under road passages. And eventually, the thought is that the two populations can be connected. There's some big habitat restorations projects happening on the other side of the road, so we're hopeful. If the project does happen, it'll certainly benefit our timber rattlesnakes, which are an endangered species. It'll certainly benefit our eastern rat snakes that also occur here in Den in the same location, which the eastern rat snake is a threatened species. And then it'll also benefit our eight other species of snakes, not to mention all the small mammals, turtles, frogs, bobcats, foxes, rabbits, weasels, and all the other mammal species that will use this. And then another major threat is human persecution. So like I said, not everybody appreciates snakes and not everybody appreciates venomous snakes. So anybody that lives or has friends that live near Western Rutland County, we want them to know that this is a free service that we offer where myself, Murray McHugh with the Nature Conservancy, the local warden, and then we have some really great volunteers locally. Any one of us can be contacted and we'll drop everything that we're doing at the moment, come out to relocate your snake or snakes. So this program aims to protect both humans and rattlesnakes. And you can see over here in the numbers, we typically move between 5 and 10 snakes a year. We also use this face-to-face opportunity to teach residents, landowners, renters about timber rattlesnakes, facts, myths, and benefits. So if you're interested, this information is on the department's website as well. And then this is my last slide. If you want to know more about the species, here are 4 great resources that are available online. They all have a price tag except for the one on the right, the Vermont Timber Rattlesnake Recovery Plan. That's freely available online. And with that, I appreciate your interest in the species. I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. I will
Thanks,
stop
Luke.
sharing.
There's definitely time. And I have about a billion questions, although I don't want to dominate. But I really want to say thank you so much for that presentation. I learned a lot. I had no idea that they lived that long. Actually their life history is fascinating.
I have a question about the highway crossings, or is that what you call them underneath?
Yes.
So there's quite a distance there that kind of funnels, as you called it, the snakes or whatever, all the little critters to one spot to cross the road. When they do that, I just wonder how many of them don't really like each other too much, and there would be some mortality just from natural predators or just hating each other or what have you. It'd be kind of, it just kind of runs through my mind that some of that must occur.
No, that's a good question. And that's something that we have talked about. That's been one of the critiques of these wildlife crossings is just as you say, they funnel species into a concentrated area. So the thought is that predators can have a heyday. So one of the I don't know of any study that has proved that. I think there's at least one study that showed that's not the case. But in our case, what we've talked about doing, um, at least for the rattlesnakes and the rat snakes, the rare snakes here, is to provide refugia there at these crossings. So we've been talking about building brush piles, where the snakes can go in, they seek cover from predators and brush piles, as well as laying down thick. So my concerns lay less so with predators because that's somewhat natural, but more so with collectors and just enthusiasts that want to get their hands on timber rattlesnakes. So what we've proposed doing is laying down big concrete slabs near these tunnels, raised up a couple inches that can't be moved, and then the snakes can get under those for cover as well. So that's a couple of things that have gone through our minds.
Hi, I'm Susan. I have a question for you.
Sure.
I recall, and it's been a long time, but up in the Northeast Kingdom at May Pond, there were signs that there was potential rattlesnakes. So has anything come of, I noticed on your little map, you had question marks for some stuff in the Northeast Kingdom. Have there been any attempts to try to prove that there are or are not snakes out there?
It's funny you bring that up. So that was before my time. That what you're talking about, I'm aware of it. What I've heard is that that report with the signs was investigated. Mark DeMules, who I introduced you, what I heard is he went up there to talk to the people, and what came out of it is what those people, they were trying to discourage would-be land buyers. There was some land up there for sale, and they posted those signs to discourage would-be land buyers. That's the story. I don't know, but just last year, maybe the year before, 2024, 2023, there's a Facebook group where somebody posted 2 pictures of timber rattlesnakes. I contacted him for more information. He didn't want to share it, but he in the comments said they were they were up in that county off the main trails. So I did some looking, found some appropriate habitat, and I went up there and did some surveys in the fall when the snakes would be coming back to the den. Didn't see anything, but there's a lot of good habitat up there, so I don't know. So that's either a hoax or it's an unknown population to us, to the state, or it's possible that somebody is moving rattlesnakes around the Northeast. That's another thought. So if anybody's got information about that potential population up there, I'd be super interested in hearing about it.
Thank you. I remember thinking it seemed like it was awfully cold in that part of the state to have any.
It's way up there, but when you look at the cliffs and the talus, there's a lot of overwintering habitat there that could be used. Yep.
Luke, is there any thought about starting new populations in those former spots, or
I've
be a
definitely
hard
thought about it.
conversation?
I've definitely thought about it. I will say, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, Massachusetts was toying around with the idea of reintroducing them to the Quabbin Reservoir on an island in the Quabbin Reservoir. So, pretty in the middle of a huge reservoir away from towns. And that went over like a lead balloon. That got politicians involved. They still have a moratorium on bringing rattlesnakes from out of state in there. So that did not go well. When I think about it happening here, the only place I could see it being less controversial is in areas like the national forest where there's huge tracts of land without homeowners nearby.
Has the population, is that holding steady-ish at 700 or so snakes?
So, when we compare my estimates to my predecessors, it looks like populations are increasing. Whether that's the case or whether I'm just better at finding them than him, I don't know. I won't say. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But I will say, you know, those estimates that I shared are from these rule of thumbs that biologists use to estimate population size. It's basically it's rules of thumbs upon rules of thumbs. So what we're doing with the pit tags and the cord antenna system, this will be a much more hopefully accurate approach. So after a number of years of monitoring, we can use statistics to help us get a better, more precise population estimate, hopefully.
I have a quick question. Since we have such a small population of rattlesnakes, are you concerned at all about like the lack of diversity in the like genotype and everything about that? Like, and what if there's like, is there like a rattlesnake disease that you're looking out for that or anything like that? I'm just curious about that part of it.
No, that's a great question. So yeah, genetics, lack of genetic diversity is a concern. My predecessor, there was a regional study with New England states. It was a genetic study, and basically I don't have that at my fingertips, but basically it came out with, yes, there is lack of diversity, but it's not as bad as New Hampshire. New Hampshire has one population. They were down to single number of snakes. They were seeing like piebald and you know, physical deformities like coloration and stuff. But they've since are doing much better thanks to some efforts they're doing. But yeah, it is a concern here. You know, and at some point it's probably a study that I'll pick back up and redo at some point. And disease, the big one for these snakes are snake fungal disease. It's relatively recently described. We have it. It's in all our populations. We don't swab snakes and test them anymore. I see signs of it. I can't be certain it's snake fungal disease, but all the indications is it's there. Some snakes, typically what I see is I see minor infections, but it can get really severe. Talking to my predecessor back in the early 2010s, it was much more severe than it is now. But yeah, that is something we have to keep our eyes on for sure.
Thanks. I have one more question about the bat riding the snake. Do snakes eat bats? I kind of figured that would be like prime food. So like, what was going on with that?
Well, I don't know. That was I used to work for Minnesota. That was a past colleague who sent that to me shortly after I moved here. You know, I hadn't got that far, but I will say, you know, if that snake is just leaving its den, I'm not sure what the case with that snake was. I assume it was just leaving its den, but it's not like, you know, snakes leave their den and they're ready. You know, there's a grace period for them to warm up. So yeah, maybe it just didn't have food on its mind. I can't, you know, I would assume it would take a bat. Certainly not a common prey species. These are pretty much small mammals, squirrels type predators, and ground foragers. So I assume if a bat, you know, I would assume it would take one if it had the opportunity, but certainly nothing common. Yeah.
I also loved that picture. I did my master's work on Indiana bats, and I was like trying to look close. I was like, that might be an endangered species on an endangered species. Make it a pretty time. I think you should claim that.
Yeah, it's a twofer.
Sort of on that note, how did you get into studying? How did you get into doing this work with these timber rattlesnakes?
Well, good question. It's funny. Whenever I give a presentation to college students or something about my career path, I always bring this up because after my first undergraduate, I did consulting work for a company in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and their specialty was landfills and gas station remediation projects. So I was on this project. We were doing site evaluations for what was going to be the biggest landfill east of the Mississippi. So we had biologists come in for doing endangered species surveys. So there's somebody came in and did a timber rattlesnake survey. So that was my first introduction. And that was the first project where I actually seed them. And this will always stick out with me. There was one heavy machinery operator. I saw a big timber rattlesnake. I said, you know, leave it alone. I'll be back. I'm going to get my camera. When I came back, he had run over it with his bulldozer. It was withering. And so I had to, you know, decapitate that snake. And then that made it on my personal evaluation that Luke cares more about the species than the client and stuff like this. I quit 3 months later, and now here it is, whatever, 20 years later, I'm on the other side of the fence, conserving the species. So that's something that always stuck with me. But I did a little bit of timber rattlesnake work in Minnesota. But that's one of the joys that come with this job.
That's a sad but neat story.
Yeah, it was sad.
So since Minnesota is often much colder than Vermont, I guess I was, when you were showing the stuff like the snakes don't like to be moving under 40 degrees. Do they have a longer period where they're doing their hibernating
Active period.
in Minnesota versus here?
That's a great question. I don't know the active period out there, but what I will say is, so we're at the northeastern extreme of the species range. Minnesota is in the northwestern extreme. So they only barely come into Minnesota down in the Bluffland countries. So in the very southeastern corner of the state, the species just barely comes in there. So yeah, I suspect that that's a milder part of Minnesota. So I suspect the active period's similar to here, if not a little bit longer. But I'm really not super sure about that.
Luke, you had that one slide about landowner calls to get you guys to get them off their land.
Yeah.
Do you get reports from hikers? How likely is it that one might just randomly encounter? I mean, I know in that small geographic area, but how likely is it someone might just randomly encounter?
Yeah.
Experience.
So, like I said, the Nature Conservancy's conserved almost all of the dens that we know of. There's only 2 dens that I know of that aren't conserved by the Nature Conservancy, and they're privately owned. So if you're walking, I'm going to make up a number. If you're walking, 1,000 feet anywhere near those dens during the spring egress period, you're bound, in the right conditions, you're bound to see a snake. But the Nature Conservancy posts so the dens and the gestation sites are the critical habitats, and they post that. So technically, you're not supposed to be in that area between April and November. During the summer, when the snakes are away from the den, at least the non-gestating females, when they're away from the den, I get reports of hikers. There's some state parks nearby where they'll see them, but by the time they move, those 1, 2, 3, 4 miles from the den, they're just so thin. It's really a chance encounter. I mean, if you see one during the summer away from the den, I mean, consider yourself lucky, because that is rare. And I suspect a lot of people walk right near them. I mean, their first line of defense is just to blend in, be motionless. Their cryptic coloration, they just go unnoticed. If by chance you do notice them, their first line of defense is that rattle, which is the kindest thing they do for us, and that's just a warning to back away. And then their last line of defense is to strike. But so
I guess I have one other question. How long do you have after they strike you? Like what would happen? Like not that I'm planning on getting stricken, but just like what happens?
So the general rule of thumb is seek medical treatment no matter how much time. Get there as soon as possible. If you can't get there for 24 hours, it's still better than nothing. And I will say, the local hospital in Rutland, they do not carry antivenom. It's expensive and it has a short shelf life. So even though we have the species in Rutland, they don't carry it. We have to. If I was to get bit, I would be heading to Glen Falls Hospital, which is about an hour away. But no matter what, it's important to get that antivenom, because things are just going to progress even if you get it 24 hours or later. All the experts say to do it. So I'll give an example. 2 years ago, the wardens responded to somebody who had a gaboon viper, which is a restricted species. You're not allowed to have it. He had this gaboon viper. He got bit. He crawled over to his neighbors. The neighbors called rescue. They came and they took him to Glen Falls Hospital. And so I had to go get that snake, but I was like, don't give him the antivenom, because that's not the right stuff. It's for the wrong species. They gave it to him anyways, and over a couple of days, his symptoms kept progressing. So days later, they life flighted him down to the Bronx where they had the right antivenom. And, I think he made a somewhat full recovery. I don't know the specifics, but, he didn't get the right antivenom until days later.
What did you do with the snake that you get from him? What Where does it go?
Most of our snakes, this has happened numerous times. They typically go to a place called Rainforest Reptile Show down in Beverly, Mass. So they take them and add them to their exhibits. Yeah.
Beverly, Mass. Where in Beverly?
Couldn't tell you. I don't know. I haven't been there.
I grew up in that area. I know the area well, but I have never heard anything about snakes.
Yeah, they're online. Rainforest Reptile Show is their name. They have presentations and whatnot, but that's typically where our restricted snakes go. Yep.
Well, thanks, Luke.
You bet.
Questions are winding down. Again, I really enjoyed your presentation. I learned a ton, so really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Absolutely. It's fun.
And folks on screen, or Luke, if you feel like making the drive, we're planning to host some amphibian road crossing experiences this spring. We always keep a weather eye out and try to get people out looking at some of that herpetofauna that we have here. It's not venomous, so
That's
it's a pretty
great.
cool experience. I will drop the link to our notification list, well, our webpage. There's a sign up for a notification list because we do sort of have to call those last minute based on the weather. But if folks are interested in seeing some of our non-venomous critters that we have in our watershed, we'd love to show them off to you.
I was thinking
That's
that would be
great.
really cool for them to all be able to go under the road instead of us standing there like hoping to see.
Oh yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Luke, where is the one? Moncton?
Moncton is a really well-known one. Yeah, pretty successful. And I saw some pictures from this last spring of a bear using it.
Oh, neat.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, those wildlife crossings are so great. Oh, I have one more question. Just
Sure.
to keep you on a little longer. The article that you put up, the 2021, is there like any sense of moving
road
that
crossing
project
one?
forward? Yeah.
Yeah, I put that up there. I wasn't going to get into it, but that's an unfortunate article. Because rattlesnakes just trigger certain folks. So I am inclusive, and I like to call them wildlife crossings, not rattlesnake crossings, because yes, it will benefit rattlesnakes, but you know, it's more than that, right? It's all sorts of species and taxa. So I made a little fuss about that article. Anyways, so the thought is that ground would be broken in the next 5 years for this project. I don't know how that's going to play out now with you know, everything going on, but I'm staying hopeful, so we'll see. Yeah, exactly.
Those things are great, and it would be good for the genetics if those two populations can interbreed.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again, Luke.
You bet.
We do have one more speaker, one more of our speaker for our online seminar series, March 20th at 6:30. We'll be joined by Dr. John Fields. He'll be talking about riverbank stabilization and river dynamics. Again, thanks, Luke. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We were going to roll into our business meeting. Folks are welcome to stay on if they want to. If not, feel free to pop off. And just one more time, thanks for joining us tonight, Luke.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me, folks.